Hello, you beautiful people. Today we are back with my updated top 50 rankings for points leagues. So I just want to preface this video by saying a few things. These are just my opinions. If you don't agree with them, that is completely fine. I'm not claiming to be an expert. I've tried my best to make them as accurate as I can, but if you disagree with any of my placements, then feel free to drop a comment and explain which ones you disagree with. We can talk about it. It's whatever. But this is for head-to-head points leagues, and they are ranked in terms of who I think will score the most fantasy points from this day, so the day after Christmas by the time you're seeing this, like December 26th, until the end of the season. It's sort of like pretending that everyone in the league is at 0 fantasy points right now, and I'm sort of ranking them in terms of who I think will finish with the most total points after the 30 or so games that have already been played this season. If I factored in points that they'd already scored, it wouldn't really be that helpful for the rest of the season in terms of rankings. So if you wanted to make a one-for-one trade with any of the people on this list, they are ranked in terms of who I would rather have, as I think they will score more total fantasy points. I will be including the entire list in the description if you don't want to watch the whole video, as I understand it's going to be a long one with me explaining all my decisions, and I just want to help everyone out with their fantasy teams. Timestamps to specific sections will also be in the description, so you can check that out as well. But if you do use the list, or if it helps you in any way at all, I'd appreciate it if you could drop a like on the video and subscribe if you're new. Don't forget to join the Discord through the link in the description if you have any fantasy questions or if you want to talk about any of my rankings. And that's about it, so without further ado, let's get into the rankings with some honorable mentions who finished just outside of my top 50. Alright, so I won't spend too much time on these guys because they're not actually inside my top 50, and they're not ranked in any particular order. I just wanted to throw a few last-minute names in terms of people you might have questions about why they're not in my top 50 or whatever, so I'll just quickly go through these guys. Tobias Harris, he's someone that I easily thought would finish inside the top 50, but his average has been way down this season in terms of his scoring numbers, and I don't see him working his way back up into the top 50 at this point in the season. I think it's pretty set at where it's at right now. I do think he'll probably finish around 35 fantasy points per game if he's lucky, but it's just the inconsistency that we've seen so far. He doesn't really provide anything outside of scoring and rebounds, and if the scoring's not going to be efficient, then he's not really a top 50 guy in my opinion. Then Terry Rozier, he's just been inconsistent. He started off the season coming back from an injury hurt, then he was on fire, and then he got the Rona. And he's been mid since he's got back. I mean, he'll probably pick it up. I think he's a bit of a buy low right now, but I don't know if he's going to finish high enough to reach inside the top 50. Similarly with Christian Wood, he's sort of been inconsistent throughout the season. His average has been fluctuating all over the place. I think it's approximately where it's going to finish by the end of the season, but I don't think it's going to take him inside of the top 50 when we account for missing games and everything as well. Gordon Hayward, I don't think he finishes top 50. I think when the Hornets are fully healthy, we are going to see Hayward's numbers start to drop. I don't think he has the potential, I don't think his fantasy average is high enough. It's only 31 points per game right now, and I do think that he just has so many really bad games that it really hurts his average and hurts his total fantasy point production. His main outlier games when he goes off are pretty much just when the Hornets are dealing with a lot of injuries or absences, so don't think he cracks top 50 either. Malcolm Brogdon, he would be, but it's just the injuries, the missed games I'm concerned about. I do factor in injury risk, and although you can never 100% predict it, you can sort of have an indication on how many games they've already missed this season, what they're looking like, and everything. And then the same thing goes with OG Anunoby. I had him ranked inside the top 50 at the start of the season, and don't worry, by the end of the season, we'll compare my initial rankings to how they finished at the end just to see how shit I did. But for now, we'll just keep going with this one. OG Anunoby, just the injury risks, and I don't really think he's going to finish inside top 50. He's missed quite a few games already this season, struggling with health, and we'll just see if that continues. But if you're going to miss a lot of games, you're not going to be able to get inside top 50 for fantasy this season. It's really competitive for points leagues, and it's just hard to find a spot in there. Draymond Green, it's just the average is too low. He's been on fire recently. I think he is a bit of a sell high right now. I would personally try to sell high on him because he's had a really good stretch as of late. But yeah, overall, he's averaging 34.8 fantasy points per game on the season. And there's just too many meh games here where he just puts up a triple single. While he does have the potential to have games like tonight where he put up 53 fantasy points against Phoenix, there's just too many of those meh games for my liking to warrant me putting him inside the top 50. Then D'Lo, he's just pretty inconsistent scoring-wise. He's a pretty inefficient scorer. He has been contributing decently in the assist category, and defensively he's been really solid, which was a huge surprise for me this season. But yeah, the inconsistency keeps him out of the top 50 for me. And then lastly, Cole Anthony, inconsistency and health concerns. He's missed quite a few games already with an ankle injury. He'll probably get back up to 100% soon, but then we got the Suggs return to worry about, and then maybe Fultz coming back as well. Not like there's any recent report, but it could happen at some point in the season. And if it does, I think that probably drags him down a little bit lower. And while he's still going to be a solid fantasy player, all of these guys are easily inside the top 70 to me. I was debating whether to include some of them in the top 50 or not, but I decided at the end to leave them out. But yeah, all these guys are solid fantasy players, like I mentioned at the start, not ranked in any particular order, but these are just guys that are outside my top 50, so if you're wondering why I left them off, I hope this sort of covers that for you. But now let's get into the official top 50 rankings. All right, so got to start off the list with a very controversial one because you guys know how we do on the channel. Going to be Damian Lillard at 50, and the reason I put the asterisk beside his name is because I just don't know where to rank him. I think this is way too low if he's healthy, but like I've mentioned in previous videos, just with the risk of the abdominal injury, he could have the surgery, we don't know. It's just someone that I don't really want on my team, so I just wouldn't advise trading for him with any of the guys that I have lower than him on the list. Like if you can trade him, if you trade for him with someone that's not on this list or in the honorable mentions, then like by all means go ahead because I think it's a really good deal. If you can sort of sell the fact that he might not play, and if you're okay with the risk, then by all means, like he could easily finish top 20, and I could be completely wrong. But just in terms of if I have him on my team, I'm probably going to hold him unless I get one of the guys that I have ranked lower than him on this list. And if I don't have him on my team, I'm really not going to give anyone that I have inside the top 50 for him, just because, like I mentioned, the injury risk is just so high, and there's so many good alternative options that I don't really want to risk it with Damian Lillard. I really like him, and I wasn't even going to put him on the list, but I just figured I'd put him at 50 with an asterisk and sort of talk about my decision in there, because I know this is a controversial one and people are very polarized about what Lillard's trade value is right now. But as I've already mentioned, I'm on the side of just not trading for him unless you don't have to give up like anything good. And like I saw people trade like a Tyler Hero for him and Josh Giddey. If you can do that for Dame, then like fuck it, like why not? You might as well. But I just wouldn't trade like a very solid player that we know is going to play and we don't have to worry about like a season-ending surgery or whatnot. The rumors are swirling and it's just not really worth your time or worrying about it, I guess, in my opinion, for your fantasy team. I like to play things as safe as possible for the most part. And yeah, that's why Damian Lillard's at 50. I won't spend this much time talking about every player because then the video will just be like an hour and a half long. But Damian Lillard at 50 with the asterisks, of course, like I mentioned. Don't need to go into it again. Then 49, we got Lonzo Ball. He was someone that I had initially ranked inside the top 50, and I still keep him there for now. He has been a little bit lackluster in terms of his fantasy value from what I expected, but he's still averaging around 36 fantasy points per game, and I do think that's going to continue. To crack the top 50, you pretty much have to be averaging like over 35 fantasy points per game. But yeah, don't have to talk about Ball too much. I'm not expecting anything drastic to change. Bam Adebayo, I still think he is top 50. His value has fallen off a lot. I had him ranked inside the top 20 at the start of the year, but just having Lowry and everyone back on the roster has completely killed his assists, which provided such a boost to his fantasy value that now that they're not there, you can really notice the impact. He's averaging around 34 fantasy points per game on the season, and I don't expect that to get any higher. When it gets, like, he'll probably finish around 35. And the only time he's had really solid fantasy games is when either Jimmy Butler or Kyle Lowry or Tyler Hero, or whenever they're missing time, then Bam Adebayo puts up like top 25 value because then he's handling the ball more and his assist numbers are up. But when Jimmy and all of them are in the lineup, he's really not contributing at the level that we expected going into this season, and I do think that's going to maintain itself for the season. He's only averaging 3 assists per game, which is down from like the 5, I think it was 6 assists per game he was averaging last season, so I don't expect his value to jump into the 40s like some people might be anticipating. We got to just remember that all of his like really solid fantasy games have come in the absences of major parts of the Heat's roster. And yeah, that's why I think he's going to finish way lower than expected, but he's still a solid enough player for me to put in the top 50 just because of what he does bring to the fantasy table. Then we move on to Chris Middleton, who is a guy who's had a very slow start to the season coming off an injury and everything, but he's just a very consistent, solid all-around player. Doesn't do anything too spectacularly otherwise except for his efficiency. But yeah, I think he's going to average around 37 fantasy points per game if I was going to guess. He puts up around 20 points per game. There's decent. The assist rate's all right. Puts up like 5 to 6 assists per game. And when you put that together, when he's shooting like 50, 40, 90, you're going to get some decent fantasy value. Nothing standout, but yeah, I do think he finishes top 50 for sure. He's not that exciting of a player for fantasy, but he's just consistent all around, and I do think his numbers will take a bit of an increase once he works his way back into full fitness. Then we move on to Miles Turner, who was a huge sell high at the start of the season. He was going nuclear. Now he's sort of cooled down, and I think this is more realistic of what we're going to expect from him. He's averaging around 36 fantasy points per game on the season. I think that is going to maintain itself roughly. I mean, unless, of course, he gets traded, but I'm not going to sit here and predict what trades are going to happen this season. I have no idea any more than you do. We can guess and make theories that we think he's going to get traded, but we don't know where, we don't know when, we don't know like what the package is going to be and whatnot, so no point speculating about. I will probably make another updated rankings video after the trade deadline passes, but for now, I'm going to put Miles Turner comfortably at 46, and we'll just go from there. Deandre Ayton at 45, another player that missed some time coming into the season, but he's been picking up the slack recently in terms of his fantasy value, averaging around 36 fantasy points per game. I do think that's going to maintain itself. I don't see any drastic shifts or changes in his fantasy value coming up soon, and his value has been a bit higher recently, ever since the 14th against Portland when he put up 51 fantasy points. But yeah, I do think he sort of will average out around 37 fantasy points per game. So he's a very solid player, don't get me wrong, but he's not going to push anywhere near the top 30 in my opinion. So he's sitting at 45 for me. And then next up, this is one of the biggest disappointments so far for this season for me personally, and it's going to be Nikola Vucevic, who I was very high on coming into this season. I know the Bulls got new players, but I still thought Vucevic would put up similar numbers to what he was doing last season, albeit on less shot attempts. But it just hasn't been the case. His efficiency is way down from three, like from his field goal percentage, just all around. It's really suffering. And it's bringing his overall fantasy value way down. He's averaging around 15 points per game right now and 10 rebounds. But I do think Vooch is still going to pick it up. He hasn't looked completely comfortable in the Bulls' offense. They're not really going to him as much as they should be, even though they have been winning games. I do think his efficiency is going to start to pick up because if you've been watching the Bulls play, it's not like he's taking like ridiculous shots that he's never hit before. He's taking very makeable shots. He's just missing a lot of them that you wouldn't really expect for a guy that we saw like make all of these shots last year. So I do think his value takes a bit of an increase, and I could see him going like a bit higher than where I have him projected. But even with the like shooting woes that we've seen from him 30 or so games into the season, I do think he still will finish easily inside the top 50 because his numbers have been really shit, and he's still top 50 right now in terms of total fantasy points. And I do think it will continue in that trend. So, or no, he's not top 50. Sorry, what am I talking about? I'm lying to y'all. But I do think he will finish top 50 by the end of the season. So could be a potential buy low. I personally bought low on him in one of my leagues. Didn't cost me too much, and I'm not too like displeased with the return. I wasn't expecting Vucevic from last season. I think that expectation's out the window, but I do think his value will see a slight increase. So could be worth trading for. All right, then we move on to another center, but this time from the Hawks, we go to Clint Capela. And he was another player who was drafted reasonably early this season. If in most fantasy drafts, I think his ADP was around 30 at the beginning of the season, and he has not like performed at that value so far. But we have seen as of late, he's sort of been on a recent surge of averaging around 40 fantasy points pretty consistently per game. Had a stretch there where he put up like 60, 57, 65, 58. And his main value is just coming from catching lobs from Trae Young, the rebounds, and the block shots. But yeah, don't need to talk about him too much. There's not that many facets to his game, and that's pretty much all I have to say about him. And then next up, at 42, we got CJ McCollum. And I know he was dealing with the collapsed lung or whatever, but we have got a report that he is fully recovered, and he's going to be reevaluated within the week. So if he gets back into the lineup, I do think we're probably going to see him average what he's averaging on the season right now, which is around 37 fantasy points per game. He's not like a stellar fantasy player just because he doesn't really contribute in too many categories outside of scoring, but he scores at a high rate, has a few huge games where, you know, he puts up like 30 points per game on efficient shooting, and overall it just sort of carries his value a lot higher than it would be for other scorers that aren't really capable of filling it up like CJ is. So I do have him coming in at 42. And we move on to another one who has seen a massive surge, and I think he is probably the biggest sell-high player in the league right now, him or Jrue Holiday, but I'm going to go with Tyrese Haliburton. And even though it is a great opportunity to sell high, I do still have him coming in at number 41. And the main reason for this is because we've all heard rumors about the Kings trading De'Aaron Fox. And don't get me wrong, he would be, if the Kings actually trade De'Aaron Fox, I think Tyrese Haliburton is top 25. Like, I'm pretty confident in that if these recent games have been any indication. But that, like, sort of depends on us trusting the Kings management to make smart decisions. And we can't really rely on that if the last, like, bajillion years have been any indication. They haven't made the playoffs in forever. Management is completely incompetent. They finally fired Luke Walton, but I still don't trust them to sort of unleash Haliburton at point guard. So yeah, we've seen his assist numbers go through the roof, averaging like 12 assists per game with Fox out. His scoring numbers are up to like 25 points per game. It's just been ridiculous. So that's why I consider him a sell high. But I think after seeing this surge, I do think Sacramento will put the ball in his hands a little bit more, sort of trust him to run the offense more. So I think his assist numbers will probably see a bit of an increase. And then, like I mentioned, if they trade Fox, his fantasy value soars. But for now, I'm going to comfortably put him at 41. He is averaging around 37 fantasy points per game on the season. And obviously, like, I don't need to talk about this too much because we don't know if it's actually going to happen. But like I said, if the Kings trade Fox, Haliburton's going to average like 40 fantasy points per game easy. But yeah, for now, even with Fox on the lineup, I do still think he finishes at round in the top 50. And I'm going to put him at 41 just because of the recent game surge we've seen. If he can continue this trend, even with Fox back into the lineup, it's going to help his fantasy numbers. And I think he will finish around the 41st spot in terms of total points. All right, so now we're into my top 40, and starting off, we're going to go with Spinny P, and he's someone who I think has been underrated to start the season because he came in injured, he was missing a few games, people drafted him pretty late, and the reason he wasn't inside my top 50 originally is because of the injury. I didn't know when he was going to return, but now that he's back into the lineup, if we're starting from today, I do think he finishes top 40 in terms of total fantasy points. He's just criminally underrated as a player, as all players on the Raptors are, man. I'm Canadian, so like the only games on here are Raptors games, so I watch quite a few of them. Yeah, I think Siakam will average around 40 fantasy points per game, probably by the end of the season. Pretty much his main damage is coming from points and rebounds, and he puts them up at a very efficient rate. Normally he shoots around 48% from the field, and I think his free throw percentage will see a bit of an increase as well. He's like the last 3 seasons he's been averaging around 80% from the line, and right now he's shooting 74, so we should see a slight uptick there. But yeah, I think overall he will finish around 40 fantasy points per game. I don't think his average is currently reflective of his performance because he had a few games when he got back from the injury, as all players do when they sort of play poorly, and it really hurt his average. So he's only at 34.6 fantasy points per game at the moment, but I do think that will increase towards 40 by the end of the season. And then next up, 39, we got John Collins. He pretty much just contributes in points and rebounds alone, but when you do so at such an efficient rate and you have a very solid rebounding rate, he averages around 8 rebounds per game on the season, I do think it contributes to like a solid baseline for your fantasy numbers, and then he averages around a block a game as well, which helps. But yeah, I do think he's probably going to average similarly to Siakam. I don't think there's a lot separating the two of them, but he's capable of having games where he puts up 20 and 10. Everybody knows when they mention Collins, they say 20 and 10 potential. But yeah, when he's getting the lobs from Trae Young and everything, his usage rate does decrease a little bit just because like the entire offense is flowing through Trae Young. But while Trae Young's in the protocols for the next week, could be a good time to sell high on John Collins. That's completely unrelated to the rankings. But yeah, I do think he finishes around 39th by the end of the season, just as a solid baseline for what he's going to average, and I do think it's probably going to maintain what we're seeing from him right now. Then we move on to a player who I also ranked way too high at the start of the season, and very much regretting it because I did draft him around 16th in my personal league. It's going to be De'Aaron Fox, and a lot of people might not even rank him in the top 50 anymore because he's been getting a lot of slander, but I am still going to put him at 38. I do think his value has drastically fallen off. I don't know what got into him this season. I wasn't expecting all these turnaround, mid-range, fadeaway, just absolutely shit shots. It's really pissing me off whenever I watch him. I don't know why he doesn't just drive to the rim. Maybe he's afraid of contact. Maybe it's the new foul rules messing up his game. I don't know. He was averaging 25 points per game last year, and now it's down to 21 on very inefficient splits, so yeah, unfortunate with De'Aaron Fox. What can you do? I do still think he maintains top 40 value. As of late, we have seen him sort of pick it up. He's had a few games where he's put up 50. And if he can start doing so on a semi-consistent basis, I think it just solidifies him into the top 50. But like I already mentioned, with Haliburton, there is the chance that one of them gets traded. Or I doubt they're going to trade Haliburton, but he could get traded. But like I said, I'm not going to speculate too much on it because we just have no idea. But yeah, if I have Fox on my team, I'm probably not going to sell him just because there is... Like, for all these players, like, I am predicting that they'll finish here, but there is a chance that they'll sort of surpass where I have them placed at. And Fox is a prime example of someone who could sort of maybe pick it up in the second half of the season after All-Star break. Who knows? But yeah, in my personal leagues, I'm holding him. I do consider him a buy low, even though I have placed him 38th, because I feel like by the time he sort of comes around, it might be too late in terms of his total fantasy value, because his numbers just aren't going to be as high, but you never know. When I update the rankings, maybe he'll place higher, but for now I'm going to put him 38th just because he still looks like he's struggling with efficiency, even though there is a few outlier games where he's put up 50 fantasy points. Alright, so moving on, we have Devin Booker at 37. He's someone who 2 seasons ago, everybody thought he was going to take off. With Chris Paul coming in, we were like, oh man, Booker's numbers are going to go way up, but in reality, it just hurt his scoring and his assist numbers because we weren't expecting Chris Paul to still be this good, but what can you do? Those are the cards you're dealt, and I do have him finishing around 37th as I've placed him here. And yeah, he doesn't really contribute as much as you'd like him to in the scoring category. I think he is capable of averaging around 27 points per game, but it's just not how Phoenix really works. They run things through Chris Paul primarily. He does have his moments. He has his games where he puts up 30 and it looks very effortless for him. He has 35-point games pretty consistently, but overall there's not too much outside of that unless Chris Paul is missing time for me to warrant putting Devin Booker any higher. And yeah, I'm comfortable putting him here right now. He did just come off the hamstring injury as well. Hamstrings are weird injuries, man, but I don't want to discount people too much because like pretty much everyone on the list at some point has experienced an injury this season, and if we just start getting into that shit, it's just going to be impossible to rank anybody. But for right now, I'm comfortable putting him 37th. And then another player, huge surprise for me this season. I thought he was going to be decent, but I mean, as soon as Sexton went down, he just turned into a beast. It's going to be Darius Garland, averaging around 37 fantasy points per game on the season, and I don't think that's truly reflective of his average because, like I mentioned, there were the games with Sexton at the start where he wasn't putting up as many fantasy points. But ever since Sexton went down, he's definitely kicked it up a gear. I think he will probably finish around 40 fantasy points per game if he continues at the rate he's been performing at. And yeah, he's really run things in Cleveland, man. Cleveland are a huge surprise in general this season, mainly Darius Garland and Evan Mobley. It's really good to see he's averaging around 25 points per game the last 7 days, and on the season he's averaging around 20. But yeah, I think that will probably maintain itself around 20 points per game, 7 assists, all around solid numbers from Darius Garland. He's really figured out his efficiency from the field. That was a huge struggle in his rookie season, but ever since then he's picked it up, and he looks like a promising young NBA player. All right, then this is another player that was very controversial, similar to Damian Lillard, and it's going to be Anthony Davis. Now, per game, Anthony Davis puts up top 10 fantasy value. I don't care who you are. You have to admit that at the very least. I know there's a lot of controversy surrounding if you should have him on your team, but that's only due to like the health and injury risks. I mean, he has the nickname Anthony Day-to-Day Davis for a reason, and that's why I had him ranked so low at the start of the season. I had him ranked around 27th, and I mean, he was proving me wrong because he was like top 3 fantasy player, and then there's a few games he missed here and there, and then boom, there he goes, down sprained MCL, reevaluated in 4 weeks. And that's just a reevaluation. We don't know exactly when he's going to be back. I think this is a similar injury to what John Morant had, and he did come back in like the 4-week timetable. But who knows? The Lakers might want to be more cautious with Anthony Davis because he does have a quite extensive injury history. So definitely something to be aware of if you're an Anthony Davis owner. You probably should have tried to trade him earlier on in the season as sort of a sell high. But like I mentioned previously, you can't 100% predict injury risk. You can just look at injury history and sort of warranting like an estimate, but then again, there's no way accurate way to do that. So who could have really accurately foreseen this? I personally was like, he's probably going to get hurt, but like I said, it's just a guess. And yeah, that's why I think while per game he is going to average around 47 fantasy points, just from the amount of missed games he's going to have if he's out for 4 weeks. By the time I'm recording this, he's already been out for 1, so there's still 3 more weeks, and that's 10 or so games of the 40 something remaining. If you're going to miss that many games, it's just going to be hard to accumulate that many total fantasy points. But that being said, just the fact that he puts up 47 per game is enough to carry him into the top 35. All right, and now I have Miles Bridges, who is someone who's currently inside the top 10 in terms of total fantasy points. But like I mentioned, if we're starting from scratch, pretending December 26th is the first day of the season, who's going to score the most? And I have seen Miles Bridges sort of take a few steps back in terms of his fantasy production, mainly due to the Hornets becoming fully healthy again. Don't get me wrong, he's still a very solid player. Obviously, as you can tell, I have him ranked inside the top 35. But we've just sort of seen his production come back down to earth. While there's still the occasional game where he puts up 50 fantasy points, he had a 71 fantasy point game against Atlanta. They're far and few in between now because of everyone returning to the lineup. His usage rate isn't as high, and we've just seen too many duds from him recently, where he puts up in the low 20s in terms of fantasy points, or low 30s, high 20s. And I think it is dragging his overall fantasy points per game down. He was around 45, and now he's down around 38.5. And I think this is more realistic of where he's going to finish the season. I don't think he's going to stay top 10 by any stretch of the imagination in terms of going forward from today. And yeah, I just think it was bound to come down eventually. He's still a solid fantasy player, but yeah, I don't think his value from the start of the season is going to maintain itself, and it looks like that's going to be the case. And I do think he's going to still finish inside the top 35. And I just realized I'm probably taking way too long, so I'll try to go through these last 3 relatively quickly. Jarrett Allen at 33. I don't think I have too much to say then. He's been a beast on Cleveland. I was worried about him playing with Lowry and Evan Mobley, but haven't seen too much cause for concern. He's averaging around 40 fantasy points per game. Don't see that changing. Easily going to put him there. I think he's been very solid so far to start the season. I don't see his value changing too much. 32, we got Jrue Holiday. I think he is a huge sell-high player right now because he's been putting up top 10 numbers as of late. And it was mainly just due to the absences that the Milwaukee Bucks had. I mean, they were missing the majority of their roster. And even though Giannis and Middleton were back today, he still put up 47 fantasy points. But if we look at the box score, is he going to average 4 steals per game? Probably not as good of a defender as he is. He averages less than 2 per game on the season. But yeah, his scoring numbers were just so inflated. He was averaging around 25 points per game. His fantasy numbers were up in the 50s per game. That's not going to maintain itself. I would definitely try to sell high on Jrue Holiday, but even if you don't want to, I do still think, like I mentioned, he finishes around 32nd or maybe pushes into the top 30. Very solid all-around fantasy player, contributes in a lot of categories, and I have no problem holding him as well. So at 31, we have Jaylen Brown of the Boston Celtics. I mean, I love me some Jaylen Brown. I do have him finishing around here. I ranked him, I think, 30th at the start of the season, and I haven't changed my mind too much. I mean, he missed the time with the hamstring injury, but like I mentioned with Devin Booker, hamstring injuries they're tricky, but I mean, I'm not going to fuss about every single injury to these players. And when he returned initially from the injury, he definitely was not at 100%, and that was reflective in his fantasy numbers. But ever since he came back after a brief pause again, he's been looking like his usual self, averaging around 40-something fantasy points per game. Yeah, he's been very solid. I do think he's going to take a step forward this season, and I mean, we're seeing it right now in front of our eyes. If you've been watching the Celtics play, he looks very confident on the ball. His scoring numbers have taken an increase, and I definitely recommend trading for Jaylen Brown if you're a Celtics fan, because it just makes the Celtics game so much better when you got someone on the team, and odds are you're not going to be able to trade for Tatum. So to my fellow Celtics fans, I mean, you got to get a Jaylen Brown on your team here and there, you know what I mean? But that's completely unrelated to my ranking, so just ignore that. I'm just going to say I have him at 31, and just ignore that. I'm tired. Alright, so at this rate, the video is going to be an hour long, so time to just speedrun. If you want more elaboration, just request it in the comments. I know I always say speedrun and then don't actually go any faster, but it's whatever. 30, Brandon Ingram. Very solid production as of late. Number 1 option on the Pelicans. He's definitely found his shooting stroke, and I do think this is more similar to what we're going to see his value. I had him as a buy low, and I think he's going to finish around 40 fantasy points per game. Sorry, I won't talk so fast so you can understand me, but anyway, Anthony Edwards. I probably have him ranked higher than most people would. And this is mainly due to the fact that he has been so consistent in terms of playing games. He's played all 82 games last season, and he's only missing games right now because he's out in the health and safety protocols. So just having that sort of reliability really boosts someone's fantasy value to me, just because I know I can trust them night in and night out to not rest games or anything. But yeah, and also to go in tandem with that, his scoring numbers are seeing an increase, and I do truly think he's going to be a superstar in this league. I think it's pretty evident right now. And yeah, I think his scoring numbers will probably maintain themselves or see a slight increase, and I do think he's going to finish inside the top 30 just from the consistency and everything. And then on the exact opposite of the consistency scale, we got Bradley Beal. I was higher on him at the start of the season. His numbers have been down, but I am not giving out hope on him. He has seen a little bit of an uptick recently. I do think he is still going to finish top 30. I think if you have Bradley Beal on your team, you got to hold out, man. I think his value is going to start to increase soon. We just got to let him get used to the new foul rules and everything, and we'll probably see his scoring numbers increase. This is a guy that averaged 30 points per game last season, and I don't think there's any way his points per game doesn't increase to at least 26. But yeah, have him ranked 28th. Jonas Valanciunas at 27. I've mentioned previously, maybe when Zion gets back, it'll hurt his value. We don't know when the fuck Zion's going to be back. Nobody knows, man. It just seems like it gets pushed back every single day. He's a solid rebounder. If you guys know me, I love the high rebounding rates. Contributes in the points category as well. Anything on top of that is just extra gravy because the rebounds are just so consistent, so solid. Love to have that on your team. It just gives a really solid baseline, or like a high floor in terms of what they're going to do on a given fantasy night. And I just love having Jonas Valanciunas. I drafted him in all of my leagues. And yeah, just a very solid, consistent fantasy player. Moving on to 26, we got Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Now, I know there's the concerns with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander that he's going to miss games because the Thunder are going to do that whack shit they did last year and shut everyone down. But I mean, we can't predict that. We don't know. They're not the worst team in the league. There's plenty of other bad teams, so it remains to be seen who's going to shut down. You just can't really bank on that. You can guess, but I'm not going to let that detract too much from Shai's fantasy value because he is putting up some crazy fantasy numbers, averaging around 37 fantasy points per game on the season right now, and that's after a bit of a slow start. As of late, he's pretty much only had 3 games below 40 fantasy points per game out of his last 15. So yeah, he's just been going pretty insane from the field. His scoring numbers are up. He's averaging around 25 points per game. His assists are up as well. He's averaging around 7 assists. Last 7 days on the season, around 6. So very solid all-around fantasy player. I'm a big fan of Shai personally, but besides the point. 25, we got Jimmy Butler. Per game, he's top 10 in terms of per game fantasy value, I should specify. But it's the tailbone injury. He's missed so much time already this season, and I am worried that he's going to miss additional time, albeit not too much more because there have been reports that he's questionable now, so he is nearing a return into the lineup. But yeah, overall, I mean, I think when he plays, if he can stay on the court, he's easily going to be top 20, but the injury concern with his back does have me put him outside top 25, and I'm not comfortable putting him any lower than this just because of how high of an upside he does have, as he's averaging around 45 fantasy points per game on the season. So yeah. Now 24, this might be a controversial one again, but I feel like I'm the only one left on the planet that still believes Julius Randle has top 25 fantasy value. I know he takes bad shots, I know he's inefficient, but he plays so many minutes, guys. He pretty much leads the league in minutes played per game. And when you put any player that's decent into that situation, it just contributes to or translates to massive fantasy numbers. And I know his numbers have been down because, like I mentioned, he takes a lot of bad shots. You'd like to see him attack the rim a lot more than he does, but it's Julius Randle. We just kind of have to accept him for what he is at this point in the season. But yeah, I think his scoring numbers will continue. His rebounding, he averages around 10 rebounds per game and 5 assists, which is really solid. It's mainly the scoring that we've seen take a bit of a decrease, and it's because of the efficiency of the shots he's taking. But like I mentioned, he shot like 41% from 3 last year. He's down to like 30%, and I do expect that to take an increase. Oh, voice crack for you. He hit 6 threes today against the Hawks. I'm not saying I think he's going to hit 6 threes every game, but I do expect his 3-point percentage to see an increase. And when that happens, I think his fantasy value will return to where it was at last season. And even if you look at him right now, I know he's been really shit to start the season. He's still top 20 in terms of total fantasy points per game at the current moment I'm recording this. And that's really just a testament to how many fantasy points he puts up by not missing any games and playing like 38 minutes per game. So yeah, I think there's no way he doesn't finish like around 24th where I have him ranked, because he's top 20 playing like absolute garbage. And I think he is going to get better as the season goes along. And I think that will translate to better fantasy numbers. But ahead of him at 23, I have one of my favorite players in the league, Zach LaVine. He's just so exciting to watch, man. But anyway, besides the point, I am trying to speed run, like I said. Averaging around 26 points per game, 5 rebounds, 4 assists. Main values coming from scoring. He's such a talented scorer, man. Like one of the best scorers in the league, easily. Gets to the rim, the mid-range, the three-point shot are all there. If you're going to put up 26 points per game on solid efficiency, you're going to be a great fantasy player, easily close to the top 20. And that's exactly where I have him ranked. Moving on, we got Russell Westbrook, who I think people do sleep on a little bit. I've mentioned it in previous videos. He's just such a polarizing player. But for a points league, I mean, I know the turnovers are a pain. The shooting percentages aren't great. Definitely hurts you more in categories leagues. But in points leagues, I mean, he's a nightly triple-double threat. And if he has like an even moderately okay shooting night, he puts up great fantasy numbers. And when you deal with the fact that Anthony Davis is going to be missing like 3 more weeks at the very minimum, what Russell Westbrook, I'm assuming, is probably going to go nuclear. I mean, he didn't have too great a shooting night against the Nets today. Still had his triple-double, but he only put up 32 fantasy points in the process. And I feel like as the season gets going, even with Anthony Davis back into the lineup, Russ is sort of going to pick up his production. I mean, we saw this happen last season. His numbers were down. Then the second half of the season, he went on a hot streak, absolute tear, and he finished with like the second most total fantasy points in the league. So even though he's playing on a crowded Lakers team, I still don't feel comfortable dropping Russ any lower than 22. He just has such a high upside that I have to put him here. So simple as that. Now I move on to a big surprise coming in at 21. It's going to be DeMar DeRozan, another Chicago Bulls player. Some people were saying he was a sell high. I personally never viewed him as that much of a sell high, just because from watching him play, he's just been killing it from the mid-range. He's getting a lot of shot opportunities. He looks really comfortable on the Bulls. He's their number one scoring option, which I did not expect. I thought it was going to be LaVine, but they sort of take turns. But I would say primarily like in the clutch, it's going to DeMar, and otherwise when they're coming down with the ball, it's probably going into DeMar's hands. But yeah, he's averaging around 41 fantasy points per game on the season. I don't think he's a sell high or anything. I do think his average will probably maintain around there. So I think he's comfortably ranked 21st for me, and that's roughly where he's ranked right now in terms of total fantasy points. I mean, he had a few missed games here. I think it was due to the Rona or the health. Oh, no, they just had their games postponed. What am I talking about? I'm tripping. But yeah, I do think DeMar will finish around 21st. So if you made it this far into the video, then I mean, drop a Lou Dort for MVP in the comments just so I can see who's really watching this. I try to go into a lot of detail for the more serious fantasy players just to explain my reasoning, but I know a lot of people that just want the rankings and don't really care for my explanation. They're just sort of taking them at face value. Maybe you would never see this part, but if you made it this far into the video, I appreciate you, and I hope this really helps you guys out with your fantasy teams. At 20, I have Joel Embiid. He is someone who, per game, obviously he's top 20, it's not even close, but it is just the health risks. But even given them, I still am not comfortable dropping him much further than this, because he puts up like 48 fantasy points per game when he plays, like roughly top 5 value per game in my opinion. And he hasn't missed too many games to start this season. He had a few games where he was out in the health and safety protocols, I believe, but ever since returning, he's been putting up very solid fantasy numbers. He'd be a lot higher, but I am just hesitant on the injury risk, like I've already mentioned. It does sort of hurt his total points per game, even though he does put up such a high average. But yeah, I think even though he is going to miss time, he'll still probably finish around top 20. And then similarly at 19, I have Ja Morant. I was not expecting this from Ja Morant. I had him ranked inside the 30s, I believe, at the start of the season. And then he went down with the MCL injury, so that definitely hurt the Grizzlies. But, I mean, they sort of like prevailed and survived anyway. But anyway, completely rambling as always. Ja Morant, solid fantasy player, points and assists, averaging around 24 points per game, 6 assists on the season. I do think that'll probably increase to around 8 assists per game. Ja Morant's just such a talented passer. If you watch the Grizzlies play, everything's running through Ja. He's really good at finding his teammates, especially in the pick and roll. And yeah, I really am a big fan of Ja Morant for fantasy. I think a lot of people are saying he's going to fall back down. I don't really know why. I mean, unless you're concerned about the injury risk, but like I mentioned, every player's had injury risk. I'm not too concerned with Ja at the moment. And yeah, I'm going to put him at 19 on my list. 18, I got Donovan Mitchell. I've mentioned him in a previous video. He just looked like he's really figured things out this season. We've seen in the playoffs his performances have taken a jump, and it looks like it started to translate into the regular season. Averaging around 41 fantasy points per game. He's averaging around similar points per game as he was last season. He's averaging around 25, but it's mainly just been his efficiency's been up. He's averaging around 5 assists, but similarly to Levine, if you're going to put up 26 points per game, and do it efficiently, you're going to be a really solid fantasy player, and that's same logic applying to Donovan Mitchell. 17, we got LeBron James per game. My guy's been insane. He's top 3 in terms of fantasy points per game. The only reason he's not higher on my list is because of the missed games, like the risk of him missing time. I don't know how much time he's going to be missing because the Lakers are really relying on him right now, and they're still losing, which is crazy. They just lost to the Nets without KD and Kyrie and everything. Like, Lakers fans, you guys are going through it this season. But yeah, I do think even with the risk of missing time, I'm not taking LeBron out of the top 20. My guy's averaging 52 fantasy points per game. Just crazy numbers, man. He's doing it all. I don't really need to talk about LeBron. I think everyone that watches this channel is aware of what he brings to the game. And who knows, this might even be a little low for him, but like I mentioned previously, I'm all for taking safe picks, taking guys that I'm pretty confident in are not going to miss time and play every night, because for fantasy, that's really all that counts at the end of the day. If they can put up good numbers and do it consistently, and no player sums it up more than Domantas Sabonis. 16, not even worth talking about because I mentioned him in every single video. Rebounding rate, points per game, assists. I'm just going to skip because I'll just go on forever about Sabonis. And then at 15, we can just ignore this because I made this list, edited all of this, and then I just saw that Paul George is going to be missing 3 to 4 weeks with a torn ligament in his right elbow. I wasn't sure about the severity of the elbow injury because he came back, and then it looks like he's going to be out 3 to 4 weeks, and he's going to be reevaluated then. So similarly to Anthony Davis, his value does drop. I would probably have him like high 40s, maybe outside of, I don't think he's going to be outside of the top 50, but like I said, it all depends on the injury risk, so just ignore him being there. Like I mentioned, I just recorded this before, or made this beforehand, and sucks to see, but what can you do? 14, we got Fred VanVleet. Very solid fantasy player, man. Similarly to Randle, he just plays so many minutes for the Raptors. I think he is leading the league in minutes played right now. And yeah, he's doing it all. He's a number 1 option on Toronto. I don't know if, like I mentioned with Siakam, I don't know how many of you watch Raptors games consistently outside of my Canadians and fellow Raps fans. So we got 20 points per game from Fred, around 7 assists, 5 rebounds. It's mainly just coming from the scoring and the assist numbers. He's a very solid player, averaging 42 fantasy points per game on the season, and I do expect that to maintain itself. And then at 13, we have the man that beats Father Time's ass on the regular, Chris Paul. Solid player. Don't need to talk about him too much. I had him ranked way lower at the start of the season because every season you're worried he's going to slow down. And it's just not the case, as is always with Chris Paul. He's maintaining where he was at last season when he finished inside the top 10 for total fantasy points. This season, very similarly, he's making a strong case for it. I'm going to place him 13th right now because I feel like the guys I have above him will finish with more total points if we start like from this current day. But Chris Paul does have a strong shout because he has just been Mr. Reliable durability the past few seasons. Hasn't missed a game in like his last 15 games or so now, so Suns, second best or do they have the best record? I think they're tied for the best record with the Warriors right now. Chris Paul leading the way, solid fantasy player. I think he's going to finish 13th. And then close to him, I have Rudy Gobert. They average around approximately the same amount of fantasy points per game, both around 42.5. Paul's at 42.8, Gobert's at 42.4. The only reason I have Gobert ahead of him, like it's very close, but it's just like the rebounding rate. I've mentioned it with other players. If they have a high rebounding rate, I just trust their fantasy production more because it's very easy to grab rebounds in comparison to like assists or steals or anything. And when you throw in Gobert's 2.3 blocks per game as well, really boosts his fantasy numbers, and his scoring is like 15 points per game. So very solid floor and high upside because he goes for occasionally like 20 games or like very close to that, and just has very high fantasy value to me. I rate highly centers that can like grab a lot of rebounds, block a ton of shots, because they just give you such solid fantasy production, and you can't really overlook that. And then at 11, we have a guy that I ranked inside the top 4 at the start of the season, and I'm dropping him down to 11th right now because we have seen his scoring numbers take a bit of a decrease with playing with Kevin Durant. He's sort of shifted into more of a playmaking role, and while he's still averaging 45 fantasy points per game, I am slightly concerned what the return of Kyrie Irving does to James Harden's fantasy value. There is the chance that they sort of like rest their stars a bit more on away games. Maybe they don't go to James Harden as much on away games, rely on him as much. because like they want to get as much out of Kyrie and rest their two superstars, while Kyrie can sort of take on the brunt of the load as he hasn't played too much this season. Well, he hasn't played at all. What am I saying? But yeah, Harden's numbers are a little bit down across the board just because his scoring numbers have decreased. He's made up for it in assists, and don't get me wrong, he could easily finish inside the top 10, I want to say. There's not a lot separating the guys I have inside the top 10 in Harden. I just wanted to put him now because I don't know how the situation with Kyrie is going to play out. Don't know what Harden's going to look like. Maybe it won't affect him at all, and he'll still just continue putting up these solid numbers. But as much as people hate on Harden, he is still a top 11 fantasy player for me. Easily could make the case for top 10, like I mentioned. It's just the uncertainty that had me rank him outside of here. But yeah, let's go ahead and finish this video off now with my top 10 player rankings. Alright, starting off, my favorite player, Jayson Tatum. I think he's going to finish 10th approximately. He's inside the top 10 right now, even with the slow start that he had to the season. His efficiency was way down, and he's definitely started to pick it up as of late. He's only averaging around 41 fantasy points per game right now, but I don't think that's truly reflective of his value because recently it's probably been around 45 fantasy points. It's just the slow start to the season is hurting his overall numbers. But going forward, I do think he picks it up. Jayson Tatum always goes nuts in January. I don't know what it is with him. January and like post All-Star break, the best times to get Tatum on your team, man. I know that actually means nothing and it's just a coincidence probably, but it's whatever. He's just a solid fantasy player, man. Like a testament to how good he is, I've mentioned it in a previous video, is that he's still top 10 despite the slow efficiency he had at the beginning of the season. So when he picks it up, as he is inevitably going to, in my opinion, it's just going to contribute to easily top 10 value just in terms of consistency, how steady of a player he is, and what he puts out on the basketball court in terms of points per game mainly. And then, the rebounding's okay. The assists aren't really that high, but I mean, scoring is such a key part of his game. He averages around 25 points per game, and he puts up like 9 rebounds. So I think he's easily going to get inside of the top 10. Moving on at number 9, we got Luka Doncic. And Luka's been having a struggling year. Some people might not even be comfortable ranking him this high because, I mean, we've all seen the out of shape, a little bit chunky here and there. He's dealing with an ankle injury, and he just went into the health and safety protocols. But yeah, I feel like when he gets back into things, his upside is too high for me to place him anywhere lower than 9th. Like, this is like absolutely as low as I'm willing to go. Because when he does play, he's averaging around 47 fantasy points per game on the season, and that is with not being at full health. 26 points per game, 8 rebounds, 8.5 assists, 1 steal. Does it all for the Mavericks. He's just such a solid all-around player. I don't feel comfortable dropping him any lower than 9th, like I mentioned. And he could easily work his way into the top 5 if he gets healthy again, but for now, we're going to put him in at 9th. Excuse me. Number 8, huge surprise, Lamelo Ball. I did not think he was going to crack the top 10. I ranked him 19th at the start of the season, and even then I was worried that maybe I was overhyping, falling into the Melo hype. But it just hasn't been the case. His scoring seen an increase. His shooting is very solid. He's averaging around 20 points per game, 7.5 rebounds, 8 assists, and 2 steals. And it's just been very consistent. He hasn't missed a lot of time outside of the health and safety protocols incident. And he's very capable of putting up games where he goes for like 50 fantasy points. But overall, he's solidly and consistently put up around 46 fantasy points per game. And I do expect that trend to continue. And when I don't have to worry about him missing time or anything due to like injury concerns, he's not out of shape like Luka is or whatever. If he's on the court putting up these kind of numbers, I think easily he's going to finish top 10 in terms of total fantasy points per game, and that's why I have him slotting in at the number 8 spot. And then at number 7, I don't think there's a lot separating these two players. It's going to be Trae Young. I know he's out in the health and safety protocols right now, but he was on an absolute tear before going down, averaging around, just give me one sec here, what was he averaging? Averaging around like 34 points per game or something crazy like that. Constantly putting up 30-plus point nights, 10 assists. On the season, he's averaging around 27 and 9. And I do think that's going to maintain itself. If we look at his recent game log, it's just crazy, man. His efficiency's up. I thought the foul rules were going to affect him. Just not the case. I know he's out in the protocols right now, like I mentioned, but overall on the season, I don't think his value is going to drop below the 46.6 fantasy points per game he's averaging right now. He's just been a very solid, consistent performer. I don't think his assist number is going to increase. I don't see any reason why his scoring numbers are going to fall off. So, yeah, I don't have too much to say, man. These guys are pretty self-explanatory for the most part. I don't think there's too much separating him and LaMelo. And there's really not that much separating him and Karl Anthony Towns as well. But I do have Towns ranked higher than him because I think he is going to pick it up into another gear. His averages are only at 44 fantasy points per game. I say 44 as if that's still not top 10. But yeah, I think he is going to finish around 48 fantasy points per game. He's definitely picked up his production as of late. He is capable of averaging around 28 points per game, and he grabs like 11 rebounds per game as well. And on the season, his numbers have been lower than that. It's around 24 points and 9 rebounds. So I am expecting a slight uptick in that averages around a block and a steal per game. And the only reason I have him ranked higher than Trae Young is because, like I've mentioned previously, it's just easier to grab rebounds than it is to get assists. And when you're putting up similar scoring numbers, Towns does it efficiently from all over the court. Don't have to worry about him really having off nights. Trae Young could have an off shooting night. I know it doesn't seem like he could as of late because he's just been hitting everything. But yeah, Towns is just a solid performer, and I do think he could work his way into the top 5 for fantasy. So far, I think he has sort of picked it up recently if we look at his recent game log and everything. And I am confident that he is going to finish top 6 in terms of like total fantasy value. But yeah, he's out in the health and safety protocols right now, as are the majority of the Timberwolves. But we'll see. When he gets back into the lineup, who knows? Trae Young's also in health and safety protocols right now. It's whatever, man. Every team's just missing guys. We can't really predict who's going to miss time or whatever. Not worth discussing too much. Moving on, we got Dejounte Murray. I drafted him in my personal 8-team. Best decision I've ever made, man. He's like second in terms of total fantasy points scored right now. I don't think he's going to finish second, but he's going to be pretty damn close. He's averaging around 47 fantasy points per game on the season. I see no reason why that would decrease. He's not too reliant on one stat that looks super inflated right now. He's averaging around 18 points per game, 8 rebounds, 8 assists, and 2 steals. And he just really figured out his game on the Spurs this year, handling the ball in the pick and roll. He looks like a fucking elite pro, which he has been so far this season. I don't think it's going to change. He's a nightly triple-double threat. Hasn't missed any games so far this season. And yeah, I think he is going to finish around 5th. Could he finish higher? Any of these guys, man, like they're pretty interchangeable outside of Nikola Jokic at number 1. I think he easily finishes with the most total fantasy points, but anyone in this top 10 has a case for moving their way into the top 5 or even like all the way up to the 3rd spot, honestly. So much talented fantasy players this year. It's crazy to see. You love to see it. But anyway, 4, we have Kevin Durant. I know with like James Harden, I mentioned the risk of Kyrie Irving returning. Maybe that hurts his numbers. Kevin Durant, I'm just not concerned about in the slightest. Averaging around 50 fantasy points per game right now. I'm a huge clown for where I ranked him at the start of this season. I was worried he was going to miss time with the Achilles injury, and it hasn't looked like it's in any fear of like reoccurring. He's been completely healthy, playing like 40 minutes per game or something ridiculous for the Nets. Averaging around 37 minutes per game, putting up 30 points, 8 rebounds, 6 assists. The dude's the Slim Reaper, man. He's just insane. Absolutely crazy. I'm such a clown for ranking him so low. I was worried about the injury. He shut me up. I'm not concerned about him anymore. I am comfortable ranking him top 4, and he could easily maybe finish 3rd above Steph Curry, but I am just going to put him 4th for now. Like I mentioned, there is the Kyrie thing. Maybe they'll sort of take a few games off Kevin Durant. And when you're talking about total fantasy points in the top 10, pretty much every game matters because they're all putting up like 50 fantasy points per game. Anyway, 3, like I just mentioned, Steph Curry. I don't think I need to talk about Curry too much. I had him ranked around 5th at the start of the season. My opinion of him hasn't really changed. You can go back and watch that video to see what I said. Pretty much the same things apply, averaging around 49 fantasy points on the season. It's Curry, bro. Like, one of the most well-known players in the league. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about him. 28 points per game, 5 rebounds, 6 assists, around 2 steals, which is an underrated part of Curry's game, as always. When you're such an elite shooter, people are bound to overlook other parts of your game. And yeah, I don't really... Anyway, I'm saying I'm not going to talk about it, but it is so late here, boys. You got to bear with me. Moving on to Giannis Antetokounmpo. Similarly, I had him ranked 2 at the start of the season. My opinion has not changed. It's Giannis, man. He's having an MVP level season, as are all these guys in the top 4, averaging around 53 fantasy points per game on the season. You don't really have to worry about him missing any games outside of like the protocols. He just does it all, man. Every time he has a weakness in his game, he just picks it up the next season. He just continuously gets better. I just love watching him play. He's so exciting when he goes downhill to the rim. And when he hits his free throws, he's putting up 60 fantasy points a night easily, averaging 27 points per game, 12 rebounds, 6 assists, around 2 blocks and 1 steal. The man does it all. There's no point me sitting here talking about it. We all know. And then at number 1, to nobody's surprise, I don't even think this is going to change for the next few seasons. The dude's just hitting his prime, coming off an MVP season. Nikola Jokic, also the fantasy basketball MVP, averaging like 58 fantasy points per game. The guy is absolutely broken. He is just literally, you could not build a better player for fantasy in a laboratory. It's just ridiculous. 26 points per game, 14 rebounds, 7 assists. Denver's complete offense runs through him. They're missing all of their star players essentially outside of him. And yeah, I just think with him carrying the team on his back, they need him to put up these kind of performances every night to win games essentially. They're honestly like a G League team without Jokic. I know that's a bit slanderous behavior because they do have some solid players, don't get me wrong, but he just is like the cog that the wheel of their team runs around. It all revolves around Jokic. They're only going to go as far as he can take them. And yeah, I think he's overlooked for the MVP discussion in real life. I have him right up there with Steph Curry and Kevin Durant and Giannis. Easily in the MVP discussion for him. He's not talked about enough by the media because he won it last year. There's the voter fatigue and whatnot. But not important. I think he is going to finish as the best player for fantasy points leagues. And that is going to wrap up the rankings. Jesus, this was a long video, but I wanted to go detail 50 through 1. Hope you guys liked it. Hope it helps you out with your trades and everything. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, just drop a comment. Let me know. Don't have to be a dick about it. We're all just trying to make fantasy trades, have a good time doing it. But thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, I hope you all have a great rest of your day and a Merry Christmas to all of you who celebrate it.